The power of words. David Miller sat on his old wooden bench, a steaming cup of tea in his hands. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves that had begun to gather at his feet. He liked this time of day, before the world fully woke up, when the silence held space for reflection. At 68, David had lived long enough to understand something most people overlook. Words are not just sounds, they are echoes that linger long after they are spoken. Some words inspire, heal, and uplift, while others wound, divide, and destroy. He had seen both in his lifetime, and he had been guilty of both. One particular memory still haunted him. It was a conversation from decades ago, yet he could still hear the sharpness in his own voice, the unintended cruelty laced in his words. He had been younger then, driven, ambitious, too quick to speak, and too slow to listen. The man across, from him, had been a friend, a colleague, someone he respected. But in a moment of arrogance, David had dismissed his ideas, cutting him off mid-sentence with a condescending remark. At the time, he thought nothing of it. He was simply being direct, efficient, honest. But the look in his friend's eyes told a different story, one of quiet humiliation, of trust eroding like sand beneath a wave. That conversation was their last. The friendship faded, not with a dramatic ending, but with silence. A silence David would later recognize as the heaviest kind of regret. Now, as he watched the golden leaves drift down from the trees, he understood something he hadn't back then. Words, once spoken, can never be taken back. They shape relationships, opportunities, and even the way we see ourselves. David had learned, sometimes the hard way, that wisdom is not about always having something to say. True intelligence lies in knowing when to speak, how to speak, and when silence is the better choice. Today he wanted to share those lessons with you, not through abstract philosophy, but through real moments, real reflections, because like him, you have probably felt the sting of careless words. You've probably said something you wish you could take back. We all have. But the good news is we can learn, we can change, we can master the power of our speech. So stay with me. In the next few moments, we will explore 6 things an intelligent person never says, 6 lessons rooted in the wisdom of time, drawn from experience and shaped by the philosophy of those who truly understood the weight of words. By the end of this journey, you'll see speech in a new way. You'll walk away with insights you can use immediately to communicate with more wisdom, to build stronger relationships, and to leave behind words that uplift rather than wound. And if you find value in this, consider supporting this journey of learning. Hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and let's continue exploring the path of wisdom together. Now, let's begin. David had always been a man of ambition. In his younger years, he prided himself on knowing more than those around him. He built a successful career in the technology sector, surrounded by some of the sharpest minds in the industry. To him, intelligence was a currency, and he spent it generously, sharing insights, correcting others, making sure people knew he was the smartest person in the room. He remembered one particular evening years ago at a company gathering. The room buzzed with conversation, glasses clinking, laughter mixing with the low hum of background music. A junior colleague, eager but inexperienced, began speaking about a new project idea. His voice carried the enthusiasm of someone who had spent days refining his thoughts, believing he had something valuable to contribute. David, standing nearby with a group of executives, couldn't help himself. With a knowing smile, he interrupted. "That's an interesting perspective," he said, his tone patronizing, "but I've actually worked on something similar years ago. Here's what you might not have considered." He then proceeded to dismantle the young man's idea, pointing out every flaw, every oversight, every piece of knowledge the junior had yet to acquire. At the time, David believed he was being helpful, even impressive. He thought he was educating, guiding. What he failed to notice was the subtle shift in the room, the way conversations around him quieted slightly, the way the young man's excitement dimmed, the way others exchanged quick glances before changing the subject. The moment passed quickly, and David moved on. unaware of the effect his words had left behind. It wasn't until months later that he understood. He was having lunch with a close friend, an old mentor who had long since retired. They spoke about work, leadership, and the younger generation. At one point, his friend leaned in and said, "David, do you know what makes a truly intelligent man?" David, still caught in the mindset of competition, responded with confidence. "Knowledge, experience, the ability to see things others don't." His friend smiled, shaking his head. "No. A truly intelligent man doesn't need to prove." David frowned. "What do you mean?" His friend set down his coffee cup. "Let me tell you something. I've met two kinds of smart people in my life. One walks into a room and makes sure everyone knows how smart he is. The other walks in and makes everyone around him feel smarter. Guess which one people admire more?" The words hit David harder than he expected. He thought back to that company gathering, to the moment he had dismissed his junior colleague's idea so effortlessly. He thought about all the times he had spoken more than he had listened, all the moments he had tried to establish his intelligence rather than let it speak for itself. For the first time, he saw what others had likely seen all along. His words, meant to impress, had only created distance. He hadn't built bridges, he had built walls. That night, he replayed the conversation in his mind. He thought about Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic emperor, who once wrote, "Nature does not boast about what it creates, and neither should we take credit for our wisdom. True knowledge, true intelligence doesn't need a stage. It reveals itself in patience, in humility, in the quiet confidence of those who do not seek validation." From that moment on, David made a conscious shift. He spoke less and listened more. When someone shared an idea, he resisted the urge to critique first and instead ask questions. When he had knowledge to share, he offered it gently, without the need for recognition. And over time, something remarkable happened. People began seeking him out, not for his intellect but for his presence, the young man whose idea he had once dismissed. A year later, he led one of the company's most successful projects. David reached out, not to advise, not to correct, but simply to congratulate him. And in doing so, he learned something even more valuable than all the knowledge he had spent his life accumulating. Wisdom isn't measured by how much you know. It's measured by how much you help others grow. David had always considered himself a decisive man. He believed that strong leadership meant making quick judgments, cutting through unnecessary debates, and steering conversations toward efficiency. To him, listening wasn't about understanding. It was about waiting for his turn to speak. He carried this mindset into his professional life, where he climbed the ranks quickly. People respected him, but they rarely challenged him. He thought this was a sign of strength, of authority. What he didn't realize was that it was something else entirely. A quiet resignation from those around him, a surrender to the idea that their words would never truly be heard. One afternoon, many years ago, he sat at the head of a long mahogany table in the company's conference room. The air was thick with anticipation as his team gathered for a critical strategy meeting. They were discussing a problem that had been plaguing the company for months, a logistical issue that had stalled production and eaten into their bottom line. A young woman, Sarah, who had recently joined the team, hesitantly raised her hand. David barely looked up from his notes. "I was thinking," she began, "what if we restructured our shipping process instead of just increasing costs? Maybe there's a way to optimize without—" David cut her off with a wave of his hand. "We've already looked into that," he said. His tone wasn't cruel, but it was final. "It won't work." Sarah blinked, nodding slightly, then withdrew into silence. The meeting continued, discussions moved on, and David barely registered. The flicker of disappointment on her face. To him, this was just another decision made, another problem dealt with. But later that day, as he was heading out, his mentor, an older colleague named Richard, stopped him in the hallway. "You handled that meeting well," Richard said, then paused before adding, "except for one thing." David frowned. "What do you mean?" "You shut that young woman down before she even had a chance to explain her idea." David sighed, feeling impatience rise in him. "Richard, I know this business. I've seen that approach before. It wouldn't have worked." Richard smiled, but there was something knowing in his eyes. Maybe. But did you actually listen? Or did you just assume you already knew the answer? David opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, doubt crept in. That night he couldn't shake the conversation. He replayed the meeting in his mind, seeing it through a different lens. He had prided himself on making fast decisions, on being the most knowledgeable in the room. But was that really intelligence? Or was it arrogance disguised as efficiency? The next morning he made a decision. He walked into the office, found Sarah, and asked her to join him for coffee. She seemed surprised but accepted. As they sat in the small cafe near the office, David leaned forward. "Tell me again about your idea," he said. "This time, I promise I'll listen." Sarah hesitated, but when she saw that he was sincere, she spoke. She explained her thoughts in detail, laying out a strategy he had dismissed too quickly. As he listened, truly listened, something unexpected happened. He realized she was right. The solution wasn't exactly what he had envisioned, but it had merit. More than that, it had potential. David brought the idea back to the team. They refined it, adjusted it, and ultimately implemented it. Within months, it led to significant improvements in the company's logistics. And Sarah? She went on to become one of the company's most valued strategists. That day, David learned a lesson far more valuable than any business strategy. He learned that intelligence isn't about having all the answers. It's about being open to the possibility that someone else might. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You cannot learn what you think you already know." Those words had never meant much to David before, but now they did. They spoke of the humility required to truly grow, the wisdom in knowing that every person you meet, no matter their age, experience, or background, has something to teach you. From that moment on, he changed. He no longer measured his leadership by how quickly he could make a decision, but by how deeply he could understand the perspectives of those around him. He made space in conversations, asked questions instead of delivering conclusions, and when someone spoke, he listened, not just to reply, but to truly hear. Years later, long after he had retired, he found himself at another gathering, surrounded by younger professionals eager to prove themselves. As he watched them debate, he smiled, recognizing himself in their impatience, in their hunger to be right. He took a slow sip of his tea and leaned in. "Let me tell you something. I wish I had learned sooner," he said, his voice warm, and then he listened. David had spent years of his life surrounded by people who complained. At work, in social gatherings, even in his own home, he had heard it all. The boss was unfair, the workload was exhausting, the economy was terrible, the weather was always too hot or too cold. It seemed like everywhere he went, there was someone eager to unload their frustrations onto anyone who would listen. For a long time, David never thought much of it. Complaining was just a part of life, wasn't it? A way to bond, to vent, to release the pressure of daily struggles. But over time, he began to notice something. The people who complained the most rarely did anything to change their circumstances. They spoke endlessly about their problems, but they never moved beyond them. Their words were like a rocking chair, always in motion but never going anywhere. There was one man in particular who made this clear to him. His name was Peter, and old friend from his younger years. Peter had always been a smart man, full of ideas and potential, but no matter where life took him, he always found something to be dissatisfied with. When they were young, he complained about how hard it was to get a promotion. When he finally became a manager, he complained about how stressful leadership was. Later, when he left the corporate world to start his own business, he complained about how unfair the market was, how customers were too demanding, how competitors always had an advantage. David listened for years, sympathizing, nodding, offering words of encouragement. But as time passed, he realized that Peter never really wanted advice. He just wanted an audience. He wanted validation for his frustrations, not solutions. One afternoon they met for coffee after not seeing each other for a while. It didn't take long before Peter launched into his familiar monologue. His business wasn't growing. His employees weren't motivated. His wife didn't understand how much pressure he was under. David stirred his coffee, listening, but something in him had changed. He was no longer just hearing words. He was seeing a pattern. After a while, Peter sighed heavily. "I don't know, man. It's just exhausting. Nothing ever seems to work out the way I want." David set his cup down and looked at him carefully. "So what are you going to do about it?" Peter blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" David leaned forward slightly. "You've been telling me about these problems for years, but I can't remember the last time you told me about something you actually did to fix them." A flicker of defensiveness crossed Peter's face. "It's not that simple, David." "I know it's not simple," David said. "But have you tried anything different? Have you changed your strategy, asked for help, learned a new skill? Or have you just convinced yourself that complaining is easier?" Peter opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again. Something in David's words struck deeper than expected. David sat back, his tone softer now. "Look, I say this because I've been there too. I used to complain about my job, my boss, my circumstances, and then one day someone asked me the same question I just asked you, and it hit me. I was spending all my energy describing my problems instead of solving them." For the first time in their conversation, Peter was silent. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, lost in thought. That was the last time David ever heard Peter complain in the same way. He didn't change overnight, but something shifted. The next time they met, instead of talking about what wasn't working, Peter talked about the changes he was trying. He took a course to improve his leadership skills. He restructured his business. He started looking for solutions instead of problems. David had learned something valuable from that experience. Complaints on their own are worthless. They drain energy, create negativity, and keep people stuck in cycles of dissatisfaction. But when a complaint is paired with action, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes progress. Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic philosopher, once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Complaining focuses on what we can't control. Action focuses on what we can. From that day forward, whenever David found himself wanting to complain, he paused and asked himself a simple question. Is this something I can change? If the answer was yes, he took action. If the answer was no, he let it go. Life was too short to waste on words that led nowhere. Years later, when David sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on how much lighter life felt when he stopped carrying unnecessary burdens. He still had struggles, everyone did, but instead of complaining about them, he faced them. And in doing so, he reclaimed something that so many people unknowingly gave away every day: his own power. David had always considered himself a man of his word, or at least that's what he liked to believe. He never intentionally deceived anyone. When he promised to do something, he truly meant it at the moment. But as the years went by, he began to realize that meaning well and following through were two entirely different things. The lesson came to him the hard way. It was a cold evening in late autumn, and he was sitting across from his teenage son, Michael, at the dinner table. The boy was quieter than usual, pushing his food around his plate instead of eating. "What's on your mind?" David asked. Taking a sip of his coffee, Michael hesitated before looking up. "Are you coming to my game this Saturday?" His voice was neutral, but there was something else beneath it, something David couldn't quite place. David barely had to think before answering. "Of course, son. Wouldn't miss it for the world." Michael nodded slowly, but David noticed he didn't seem relieved. There was no excitement, no smile, just a quiet acceptance, as if he had already prepared himself for disappointment. And that's exactly what happened. That Saturday, David's phone buzzed with an urgent call from work. A last-minute issue had come up with a client, something that, in hindsight, could have waited. But in the moment, he convinced himself that business had to come first. He promised himself he'd make it up to Michael later. By the time he arrived home that evening, the house was silent. He found Michael in his room, sitting on the floor, still in his jersey. His cleats were kicked off to the side, and the medal from the game hung loosely from his fingers. "You won," David said, forcing a smile. "That's great, son." Michael didn't look up. "Yeah," he murmured. "It was a good game." David walked closer. I'll come to the next one, I promise. Michael's grip tightened around the medal. He let out a small breath, one that sounded far too old for a boy his age, and then, quietly, he said the words that David would never forget. Just want you to mean it when you say it. The room felt heavier in that moment, as if the weight of every broken promise David had ever made had settled onto his shoulders at once. He wanted to defend himself, to explain. Work had been unpredictable. Life had been busy. He never meant to let Michael down. But none of that mattered. The truth was his son had stopped believing his words. That night, David lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about all the times he had made a promise without truly considering what it meant. He had told friends he'd catch up with them soon, but never set a date. He had assured his wife he'd help around the house, but let the tasks pile up. He had promised colleagues he'd review their work by Monday, but always found an excuse to push it back. And now, he was seeing the consequences. Every time he had failed to follow through, his words lost their value. He hadn't just disappointed people, he had taught them not to trust him. The next morning, David made a decision. He wouldn't make any more promises unless he was absolutely sure he could keep them, and if he said he would do something, he would treat it as unbreakable. It wasn't an easy change. At first, it meant saying no more often. When a colleague asked him to take on an extra project, he didn't automatically agree. He took a moment to think about whether he could genuinely commit to it. When a friend invited him out, he gave a clear answer instead of a vague, "I'll try." And most importantly, when Michael asked if he'd come to his next game, David didn't rush to say yes. Instead, he checked his schedule, made sure there were no conflicts, and then, only then, did he look his son in the eye and say, "Yes, I'll be there." That Saturday, as he sat in the stands and watched Michael sprint across the field, he saw his son glance up at him, just for a moment, just to check, and when their eyes met, David saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Belief. It takes years to build trust, but only moments to break it. David had spent too long underestimating the power of his own words. Now he understood. Promises are not just things we say to make others feel better in the moment. They are contracts, and every time we break one, we lose a piece of the trust we worked so hard to build. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Let your words be plain and true." A promise is not meant to impress, it is meant to be honored, and in the end, we are not remembered for the things we said we would do, but for the things we actually did. David had always believed that strong leadership meant never showing weakness. Mistakes in his mind were liabilities, flaws that could undermine authority, diminish respect, and make him look incompetent. So, whenever something went wrong, under his watch, his instinct was always the same: deflect, justify, or minimize. It wasn't that he outright lied. He just found ways to frame things so that the blame never fully landed on him. For years, this habit served him well, or so he thought. In meetings, when projects failed or deadlines were missed, he always had a reason. The market had shifted unpredictably. The team hadn't executed the plan properly. The information available at the time hadn't been sufficient. There was always an external factor, always something beyond his control. And since he was experienced, confident, and persuasive, people rarely pushed back. But then came the day that changed everything. It was the biggest deal of his career, a high-stakes contract that could take his company to the next level. David had been the one leading the negotiations, assuring the executives that he had everything under control. He had been so eager to close the deal that he had overlooked a critical detail in the contract, a clause buried deep in the fine print. That left his company financially exposed. He hadn't read it carefully enough, hadn't consulted the legal team as thoroughly as he should have. But by the time anyone realized it, it was too late. The deal was signed and the consequences were unfolding. The fallout was immediate. Investors were furious. The board demanded answers, and his team, people who had trusted his judgment, were left scrambling to clean up the mess. David sat in the conference room, facing his colleagues as they looked to him for an explanation. The usual excuses formed in his mind. He could blame the legal team for not catching the issue. He could argue that the other party had been deceptive. He could say that no one could have foreseen this. But then He saw something in their faces that made him pause. Disappointment. Not anger. Not frustration. But the quiet, heavy disappointment of people who had believed in him, people who had followed his lead and now realized that he was unwilling to take responsibility. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. For the first time in his career, he took a deep breath and said the words he had avoided for so long. "This was my mistake." The room was silent. His own voice sounded foreign to him, but he continued. "I should have reviewed the contract more carefully. I should have consulted the legal team before signing. I made an assumption, and I was wrong." He braced himself for the backlash, for the loss of respect, for the consequences. But instead, something unexpected happened. His team didn't attack him. They didn't tear him down. Instead, they looked relieved. It was as if his admission had given them permission to stop pretending, to stop tiptoeing around the obvious truth. And then, something even more remarkable happened. They shifted their focus to fixing the problem. Instead of wasting energy blaming and defending, they came together to strategize, to adjust, to salvage what they could. That day, David learned one of the most valuable lessons of his life. He had spent years avoiding blame, thinking it made him look strong. But in reality, it had only made him fragile. The more he resisted responsibility, the more brittle his leadership became. True strength wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about owning them, learning from them, and growing because of them. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If someone is able to prove me wrong and show me my mistake, I will gladly change. For I seek the truth, and the truth never harmed anyone." David had spent so much of his life fearing that admitting mistakes would make him look weak. But in the end, he realized that the real weakness had been his fear of the truth. Years later, long after he had left the corporate world behind, he found himself sitting on his porch, watching the golden hues of the evening sky. He thought about the people in his life, the friends, the colleagues, the family members, who had trusted him not because he had been perfect, but because he had finally learned to be honest. Mistakes were inevitable, but the way we handle them defines who we are. And in the end, no one loses respect for a person who takes responsibility, but they do lose respect for someone who refuses to. David had always been a man of big ideas. He had a mind that never stopped working, always crafting visions of what could be. Throughout his life, he had imagined starting a business, writing a book, traveling the world, learning to paint. Each time inspiration struck, he would share his excitement with whoever was around, a friend over coffee, his wife during dinner, colleagues at work. He spoke with such passion that people believed he was already on the path to making those dreams a reality. For a while, that belief made him feel accomplished, as if speaking about his plans brought him one step closer to achieving them. Yet as the years passed, he began to notice a pattern. His ideas rarely materialized. The business never launched, the book remained unwritten, the travel plans stayed in the realm of someday. One afternoon, he sat with an old friend, Thomas, a man he deeply respected. Thomas had never been one to talk much about his goals, yet somehow he always seemed to accomplish great things. He had built a thriving business, learned 2 new languages, and even taken up marathon running in his 60s, all without making grand declarations. As they sipped their coffee, David found himself confessing his frustration. "I don't understand, Tom. I have all these ideas, all these things I want to do, but somehow they never seem to happen. I get excited, I make plans, I tell people, but then life gets in the way. Meanwhile, you just go out and do things without ever talking about them. What's your secret?" Thomas smiled knowingly and set his cup down. "David, let me ask you something. When you tell people about your plans, how do they react?" David thought. For a moment. "Well, they usually get excited. They tell me it's a great idea, that I should definitely do it. It feels good, you know?" Thomas nodded. "That's the problem." David frowned. "What do you mean?" His friend leaned back, choosing his words carefully. "There's a reason ancient wisdom warns against speaking too much about your plans. When you talk about what you're going to do, your brain rewards you as if you've already done it. That burst of satisfaction, of validation from others, tricks you into feeling like you've made progress, when in reality you haven't moved an inch. David sat with that thought for a moment. He had never considered that his own excitement might be working against him. Thomas continued, "I've seen it happen too many times. People love to announce their goals because it makes them feel good in the moment. But the more they talk, the less they do. The truth is, real work is quiet. Discipline doesn't seek applause. Action doesn't need an audience. The only thing that matters is what actually gets done." The words struck David deeply. He thought back to all the times he had told people about his plans, soaking in their encouragement, only to lose momentum soon after. He realized he had been spending his energy in the wrong place, on words instead of actions. That day he made a decision. He would stop talking about his dreams and start working on them instead. At first it was difficult. He had grown so used to sharing his excitement that it felt unnatural to keep things to himself. But slowly something changed. Without the instant gratification of others' praise, he found himself more focused. Instead of telling people he was going to write a book, he simply sat down and started writing. Instead of announcing his plan to get in shape, he laced up his sneakers and went for a run. Months later, when he finally mentioned to Thomas that he had finished the first draft of his book, his friend simply smiled. "Now that," he said, "is worth talking about." David had learned a lesson he wished he had understood years earlier. Words are easy. They create an illusion of progress without requiring real effort. But action, quiet, consistent, relentless action, is what separates those who dream from those who achieve. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one." And so, David stopped announcing and started doing. He let his results speak for themselves, and in the end they spoke louder than any words ever could. David sat on his porch, watching the golden light of the setting sun filter through the trees. The years had taught him many lessons, but none as profound as the power of words. They were more than just sounds. They were reflections of the person he had been, the choices he had made, and the legacy he would leave behind. Looking back, he saw how his words had shaped his life. In his younger years, he had spoken too much, too quickly, believing intelligence was something to prove rather than something to embody. He had dismissed others' ideas without listening, made promises without considering their weight, and, at times, let his pride keep him from admitting his mistakes. His words had created distance where there could have been connection, and in trying to appear strong, he had unknowingly weakened the trust others had in him. But life had a way of teaching through experience. The moments of silence after a broken promise, the lost friendships caused by careless remarks, the opportunities missed because he had spoken when he should have listened. Each had left an imprint, a lesson that had reshaped him. With time, he learned that true wisdom wasn't in speaking the loudest, but in choosing words carefully. That the most intelligent person in the room wasn't the one who talked the most, but the one who listened with the intent to understand. That respect wasn't built on eloquent speeches, but on actions that aligned with one's words. Now, as he sat in the quiet of the evening, he understood something simple yet powerful. His words had once defined him, but his actions had redeemed him. If there was one message he wished to share, it was this: speak less, mean more. Listen more, judge less. Promise only what you can. Keep and let your actions carry the weight your words once did. In the end, people don't remember what you intended to say. They remember how your words made them feel and whether you lived by them. So, as you move forward, ask yourself, do your words reflect the person you want to be? Do they build trust or erode it? Do they inspire or diminish? Because in the end, the things we say leave a mark, not just on others, but on the person we become. If this message resonates with you, consider joining a community of those who seek wisdom, reflection, and growth. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and be part of a journey toward living with greater intention. Because in the end, it's not just about what we say, it's about who we are.